In today's episode of Multispective, you will follow Luciana's remarkable journey from trauma to recovery. After surviving sexual abuse by a close family member and the neglect by the rest of her family, she had nowhere to turn but inwards, and as a result developed a severe eating disorder to cope with the shame of what had happened to her.
When I finally confronted my perpetrator, the response I got was, well, I went to confession.
Listen further about how she explored therapy and spiritual healing with ayahuasca in the Amazon and the steps that she took thereafter to overcome the pain from all the trauma.
And after about 20 minutes of receiving this medicine, my entire life was technicolor.
Dr. Luciana, welcome to Multispective. I'm so excited to have you here. How are you doing today?
Thank you. I am doing great. Thank you for having me, Jennica. I appreciate it so much.
Yeah, you have such an interesting story, and I find it really amazing the sort of like paths that you took to sort of like recover and heal from like the traumas that you experienced in your childhood. I believe our listeners are going to be able to take so much away from your experience as well. And so I'd love to like just dive right into it. So why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about your childhood? Where are you from? Where were you raised? And your family?
Oh, excellent. Great. Well, I was raised in Minnesota, which is a state in the north of the United States. And I was raised in a family, youngest of 7. And by the time I came along, my parents were just totally wiped out. They had been through so much, Jennica. I mean, I didn't even know how much they'd been through until I actually wrote my memoir, and it gave me perspective to look back. But I grew up, and as I grew up as an abandoned child because there just wasn't the space and the capacity in their lives to manage another little person in the house. And so I would find myself walking every day outside just by myself. By the time I was really little, like 4 years old, I would be walking by myself in the trees and the forest, and I just loved it. By the time I was 4 years old, then I had this relationship develop with Jesus of all spirit things. And Jesus came in and just started talking to me, which was really epic. And it set the scaffolding for the rest of my life. But we'll get to that later. But just in terms of my history, so I became besties with Jesus. And little did I know at that time that that would be a saving grace for me later on in my life. So I grew up, became besties. As life turned out, my life took some really difficult turns. I ended up suffering from pretty severe abuse then at the age of 6 or 7 through the age of 12 or 13 when our family left the area that I grew up in. Left that area that we grew up in. We moved to Southern California, which was fantastic. I had really a charmed life for, from a lot of perspectives, but I had a lot of secrets too. I had a lot of secrets. I had developed a raging eating disorder as a young person as a way to deal with the suffering that I endured as a child. So I went along in life kind of pretending that everything was fine because I thought I had to in order to be a good person, right? I didn't think I was worthy of really being able to share my story. Yeah.
Who sort of like taught you this narrative of not sharing the abuse that you were facing at a young age? Were you taught this in school, or was it family members that said like, we must not talk about these kind of things? Like, where did this idea develop in your head? Because I've heard of some stories of young kids who've gone through this and maybe they haven't quite understood or grasped the concept of like, the shame around abuse and sexual assault. And so they just sort of say it as in like, oh, he touched me, in a very casual manner. But for you, you seem to sort of like quickly understand that this is, I must not say it to anyone. I'm curious about that.
Yeah. Oh my heavens, that's such a great question because I think I'm not unique, actually. So what happened is I shared that I became besties with Jesus when I was so little, but I also grew up Catholic. So it wasn't long after 4 or 5, when I was developing this beautiful relationship with Jesus, that dogma from a religion came in and started to tell me, this is what God likes. This is what God doesn't like. This is what you have to do to go to heaven. If you do these things, you'll go to a place called hell, and it's really, really bad. Now, religion is not a bad thing, and I don't bash it in life, and I certainly don't do it in my memoir. However, when religion has very strict dogma, it can be very confusing to people. So, how that was confusing for me was that I grew up thinking, of course, God was a loving God and a forgiving God, but God was also very judgmental. God wanted me to be a peacemaker. God wanted me to forgive everyone. And that's what you just had to do. You just forgive. God wanted me to, according to my dogma and my family, to be the one to respect no matter what my elders. And so there wasn't the space. And I don't think it was intentional. Don't tell. But there wasn't the space for me to tell anybody because it just became so confusing. And then you couple that with shame and guilt and not having really any deep connection with my family. Well, I had a yearning connection to be seen and be loved. The narrative was, oh my heavens, if I tell, I'm already not loved. I'm just going to, further my suffering.
Right.
And I was so desperate to be loved. And so actually, the title of my memoir is God's in a Box on My Dresser, an inquiry into the human capacity to thrive. And the reason I titled it God's in a Box on a Dresser is just for the reasons you're asking. It's because when we define God, I believe we keep, and I'm going to use him, even though I don't really describe gender, but pronouns. When we keep God in a box, that we define God in certain ways. And when we have God defined, it is by definition limiting then to us. And we don't have a capacity with a very strict definition to see anything outside that box. And it becomes almost like an ice box. Things inside of it are just frozen. And so all those narratives from a child about be a peacemaker, don't tattle on other people, God, loves people who don't make chaos in the world, just created this story within me that I had to manage all my suffering. Oh, there's one other really big one that comes up in some Christian realms, and that is that not only are peacemakers the great ones, but suffering brings you closer to God. That's a very common narrative. So, it's just these stories and these narratives about God that get stuck and entangled. And maybe the last thing I'll say about that for right now is I was sexually abused. And so, be a peacemaker, be a good girl. And I grew up, purity, be a good girl. The last thing you feel when you've been sexually abused is like you're a good girl. So, these narratives get just entangled and, there's nothing to do but try to deal with them. And so for me, my way of dealing with those narratives and with that suffering was to choose an addiction, an eating disorder. Now, of course, I didn't consciously choose it and one day say, oh, how am I going to manage this?
Of course.
But it's just the natural process. When people suffer, if there's not an outlet to manage that suffering, we have to, as humans, we turn to a tool, right, to bypass. Yeah, so that's a really great question.
So I just want to go a little bit further, like a little bit deeper into the experience that you had at that moment. Was there anybody, say not family, but it could be a friend at school or a sibling, since you had many siblings, anybody that you felt close enough that you could talk to, or even that maybe picked up on certain signs, like your teacher maybe picked up on signs like, okay, she looks like something's not right. Like we need to have a conversation with her about this.
Isn't that amazing? Not a person. My siblings, so being the youngest, my eldest sibling was 12 years older. So, by the time I'm 7, right? They're 19. The other siblings are young teenagers going through their own stuff, barely surviving in the big, great world as, teenagers have their own thing going. But no, not a person. From the time I was young, I really thought I needed to keep it together. Now, there were signs. There's no question there were signs. But I think so. I'm 57 right now. So I think, 50 years ago, 49 years ago, I think people didn't have the awareness that thankfully people do today. I think, especially about sexual abuse and predatory behavior. In fact, I became a person in Minnesota to help train people how to look for predatory behavior and be on the watch for, what those signs are, how they manifest in the perpetrators, and then the effects on children. I don't do that work anymore, but that was really powerful work for me at one time. So there just wasn't, I don't think, the awareness. And if people did, people had shame even about their children if they knew they were abused. Oh, don't tell, it'll bring a family stain. We had a great uncle. Very sadly, I didn't know this person, but he committed suicide. And being a great uncle, obviously older than me, the family narrative for years was don't tell anybody or make up a story. So, really difficult. And like I said, the more that I have talked about this over the last 6 months publicly, after my book has been published, or like 4 months, the more I realize my story is not unique. And that's one of the reasons I really want to get my story out there. And it's not as much because, it's not as much about me, perhaps, but it's about helping people be able to say their story and just shame no more. And it's not an excuse like, oh, people didn't know, my parents didn't know, they were busy. It's not excuses, but it's just understanding the context from where my secrets came. I will also say that I've met plenty of people who say that's my family now. Secrets, we live by family secrets. Yeah. So I also want to give hope to those people who feel the pressure to keep family secrets. Some secrets need to be told in a very healthy way, and being mindful that there can be victims to our stories too. Right. And I say that just as a quick aside, because I was very cautious in writing my book. The person who abused me, their children are just lovely human beings. And they loved, of course, the person who abused me. So it's really complicated for, people who have loved perhaps a perpetrator. So for me as a victim, I was very aware that I don't have any need to protect, of course, the perpetrator. But when there is like collateral people who did no harm and who are loving people, it's important just to have awareness and have good communication with them, to let them know this is a story that I need to tell, but I care about you in the process.
That's a really tough one. I mean, I imagine you're basically telling them you're basically collapsing their world around them, because they have this idea that this person is, their idol, or they respect them, they look up to them, and, to find out that they've been involved in such, difficult, experiences as such, and have caused such pain it's really, I can't imagine how difficult that must be. And for you too, to maintain a relationship with their loved ones, knowing that you may come across this person again and again, that must have been really difficult. So if you don't mind me asking, how was this a family friend, or was this a relative?
A relative. It was actually a brother-in-law. Yeah. So it was an oldest sibling's husband.
Wow.
I know. And so at a very young age, because there's so much distance, between us, what would happen is when my sister started having children, I would babysit. And that's when it would happen. And I would be required to sleep overnight. And this was dozens, 50 more, times. And it was a situation that as a child I didn't have any control over, and it's complicated because as an adult I've had two people say to me, well, why didn't you say something? Why didn't you say something to one of your parents or to somebody else that this was happening, or you didn't want to babysit? And oh my heavens, I tried to get out of babysitting so many times. But as a young person, 9 to 13, you don't have a lot of power in a household sometimes. And I already felt by that point that I wasn't worth anything. So, when somebody doesn't feel worthy of love or care and compassion, and then it's complicated by growing up with narratives of be a peacemaker, and this is, God loves peacemakers. The last thing I was going to do is upend the peaceful, loving family, and it's very possible they wouldn't have believed me. I mean, what proof is a, 10-year-old, 11-year-old going to be able to, show the world that something's happening? So it's really complicated.
Can you walk me through the religion a little bit more? Was your family Christian or Catholic, or was there another name to it?
Nope, we were Catholic Christian, right? Catholics are Christian.
Okay.
Yeah. So I grew up Catholic, and there's so much about the Catholic religion that I think is just so beautiful, and about Christianity too. But once again, even though there can be beautiful aspects of religion and dogma, my experience with a lot of the world's religions is they have very strict definitions about God. And as I was saying earlier, it's what God likes, what God doesn't like. And so, especially in the Catholic tradition, purity, be pure, no sexual relations before you're married, don't tempt other people so that they might have sexual desires, and so many other narratives. So even though those narratives, somebody might say, oh, but those are positive qualities, I don't necessarily believe those anymore in the same way. But it's not about those narratives. It's what happens when God's in the box, because those narratives become the way you have to think and believe. And there's no space to imagine God or be curious about God outside of those rules. So you have these rules, you have these ways of looking at the world. And then, of course, as children, you grow up in tremendous fear, fear for myself, that if I say anything, I might go to hell. I didn't have a capacity as a child to think, well, wait, that might not exist. Wait, I could think about maybe that differently. And then other people, family members, if I spoke out, would this person go to hell? Would I be responsible for them being sad? Would I be responsible for my sister being sad, or, for their family breaking up? And the way that I was taught I would.
What about the concept of God being omnipotent, omniscient, all-knowing, that, he knows what, goes through our minds. So it was this whole idea of not only your actions are being judged, but also your thoughts are being judged. Did you ever go to confessions? Try to talk about it with a priest? Did confessions or not even that?
No. Because by the time I was ready to start going to confession, there's no way by that point I could have said anything to anyone. It was as if those experiences, which were continuing, by the way, after my first confession, it's as if those stories were just so locked in me. And now by this point, it wasn't just the God narratives. It was also now I had learned about shame and guilt, or not just learned about, I had taken it on. And the confessional was all about, I swore yesterday, I talked back to my parents,
Right.
those sorts of things. But I
Right.
will tell you, this is another part of my story about God in the box and how, I really yearn for people to be able to be curious about God, be a part of whatever religion you feel attracted to, but be curious and expand the image of God or of spirit beyond what you could possibly know within the limits of
Hmm.
what anybody tells you who God is. One of the complications and another problem with God in a box is when I finally confronted my perpetrator 30 years later, the response I got was, well, I went to confession. In other words, right? Well, I went to confession and I told the priest what I did. And so I'm good. What's your problem? And his response to me was specifically, I made my peace with God. There's nothing else I can do. And I, I was very pointed in my response. I did say, I said, well, I think my understanding of God is that, God's a relational God. And so it's repairing relationships.
Hmm.
And we had a relationship that was abusive. So it's my understanding with how God works that, we need to not just go to confession, but actually repair the relationships, the damage that we've
Hmm.
done through our, if you want to call it sin, well, we called it sin, of course, as Catholics, when
Hmm.
you sin, and he just kind of blew it off. And then when I confronted his wife, I got the exact same. Well, I didn't confront his wife. His wife then called me and wanted to talk. I got the same thing. Well, he went to confession. And so, you see, uh, sort of a double-edged sword. As beautiful as religion and dogma can be, it can also be a tool, and not intentionally, but
Hmm.
it can become a tool that can oppress people, and can
Hmm.
become a tool that allows people to spiritually bypass or cognitively or emotionally bypass their human
Hmm.
responsibilities.
Right. Um, were you able to forever forgive? Or not, I mean, like maybe not forget, but forgive, because that is also one of the
Mhm.
very big sort of understandings and practices of the religion, which is, forgive those who hurt you. But, and maybe you reaching out to confront your perpetrator was with the intention to air it out and get that apology so you could get that closure. But having
Yeah.
the response that he did, showing no remorse over it, or him basically saying he sought out forgiveness from God, he doesn't need forgiveness from you. Did that make it even
Right.
harder? Did you ever get past that?
I now think of forgiveness very differently. Um, so, part of my idea now of forgiveness is working with the self. In other words, I had to forgive myself. I had to forgive myself for not speaking up, even though I didn't know I could. I had to forgive myself for other harm that came or could have come to people because through him, uh, because I didn't speak up. I had to forgive myself for having an eating disorder that almost killed me, and for all the crazy behaviors and money I spent and how I treated myself.
Mm,
So forgiveness for me is more of an internal process towards self. And once I was able to forgive myself, what he did didn't matter. And I know there's a lot of stories about the power of forgiveness, but forgiveness externally, in other words, me forgiving him for what he did, um, there's really nothing there for me. And I know it's complicated because there's so many books written too on when you forgive, you will be free. But
mm,
it's not really forgiving the person for what they did, because how does that work when somebody sexually abuses you for years and you
mm,
say, I forgive you? I mean, I can understand, I can not have it affect me anymore behaviorally. I
mm.
cannot have the emotions debilitate me anymore. I can see you as a full human being. And
Right.
that's about all I can do. The word forgiveness is just, to me now, a really weird word. in
Interesting.
relation. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Interesting. Do you think that
yeah.
that would have been viewed differently if he had given you an apology? Like if he had said, "I am so genuinely sorry. I know what I did was intentional and it went on for many years, so I'm not excusing my behavior or anything. But looking
Hmm.
back on it now, having my own kids or, being in this phase of my life, I see the pain that I didn't see before, or I genuinely from the bottom of my heart, I'm so so sorry for all the pain I caused on you." Do you think that would,
Hmm.
like, the concept of forgiveness would make a bit more sense?
Hmm. Yeah, maybe, maybe. And I 100% get why that's important for a lot of people. And I
Mm,
honor that. I absolutely honor how beautiful in a way that would be to hear from a perpetrator. But at the end of the day, Jennica, and this is what I had to sit with in the jungle, at the end of the day, even if somebody says that to me, it's me who has to live and walk in the world,
right.
right? It's me who has to forgive myself.
Mm,
And the last thing that I would want for myself now or other people in hindsight is for somebody external to me to have agency over how I thought, talked, behaved, or emoted. So
right.
even though I 100% agree that would perhaps have been really nice to hear,
Mm,
I don't think that would have flipped a switch in my head that just said,
mm,
oh, you don't need to feel shame anymore. Oh, you don't need to feel guilt anymore. All
right.
those things you did to harm yourself, you know,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter anymore. So it gets really complicated because, again, at the end of the day, it's still me having to live and navigate in the world, with everything that happens.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I think it's nice and I think it's great. And yes, any perpetrators are listening, or any people who need to ask for forgiveness are listening. Please, yes, absolutely, totally embrace the idea of asking for forgiveness and true apologies. And then I guess the next step for people who choose that path, which of course I support, is just to recognize that other person may still significantly struggle. And those words
Mm,
aren't a panacea that are going to swoop in and make everything okay. And that's easy to logically know.
mm.
It's a whole nother thing to behaviorally and emotionally really get if you haven't been a victim of childhood abuse.
Right. Now, let's talk a little bit about this eating disorder that you say you developed. You
Yeah.
mentioned that it wasn't an overnight thing, that it was something that was gradual. Can you tell us a little bit about
Mhm.
that? And yeah.
Yeah. So I was young when consciously, I knew by the time I was 9. Now, this is in hindsight, of course, in hindsight. By the time was 9, I had developed an eating disorder. And how it developed at that time was after church every Sunday, my family, and there was only me, really left at this time in my life, like going to church and then going out to dinner. I would just order a plate of parsley. And everybody thought that was so cute because I loved parsley and we would usually get it for free and how healthy. And so I would eat parsley and I would eat very little during the day, especially if it were in front of other people. That wasn't a conscious choice of mine, like, oh, I'm suffering, I'm going to manage it through food. But it just so happens food and emotions, as we now know, are so connected. I come from an Italian family. So, of course, food is used for everything. Oh, you're sad? Eat some
Mm,
pie. You're happy?
mm,
Let's go get some pie. Have some more food.
right.
And, and so emotion, it was just a natural connection from the time I was born, really, food and emotion. And so when I was suffering so badly, it just so happened that connection came to me. And I started using food to not have to feel, and it worked. It worked. Now, in the day, I mean, I'm not that ancient, but there wasn't really talk about eating disorders. And if there was talk about it at that time, well, I had never even heard of an eating disorder until I was in my teenage years, right?
Mm-hmm.
But even when other people were suffering, and still today, there's so many narratives around eating disorders. Like people just want to lose weight. You just want to look good. It's about vanity. And of course, we know psychologically it's not about those things. Like
Mm.
any other addiction, somebody who suffers from an addiction, it's because they're suffering, period. No matter what the addiction is, they're suffering and they're trying to navigate extreme emotional trauma and stress. And they're looking for a tool to bypass that. And of course, addiction is the way to do that. So for me, it started when I was very young, but then, it just got worse and worse and worse. My mom actually found out about it when I was in high school because I kept passing out on the field for one of the sports that I was in. And my instructor called my mom and said, I don't know what's wrong with your daughter, but she keeps passing out on the field. And my mom just blew it off. I remember her having the conversation. She's just like, why are you passing out on the field? And I'm like, I don't know. And that was the last. That was the last we had a conversation about it. So I was able to just continue this behavior without really any attention to it. And then that behavior, as it continued to worsen, my life became in danger, of course. And my need to hide now, not only my difficult experiences and emotions, my traumatic experiences and emotions, now I needed to hide the pain, shame, and embarrassment of having an eating disorder. So this eating disorder progressed. And by the time I got help for it, the help was also complicated because I had children by this time and I desperately wanted to heal. I didn't want my kids to know that I had this issue because I didn't want them to suffer. So as it turned out, I kept a secret, a very big secret, not just about my past and my suffering, but now about this eating disorder. Well, on a side note, but a really important side note, my dad was an alcoholic growing up, but he was a closet alcoholic. In other words, I didn't even know he was an alcoholic until I went to college because he never drank during the day. After everybody went to sleep, he would drink all night and then somehow able to go to work the next day. So he kept that secret. And what I realized and what struck me really powerfully in writing my memoir is that I had become my dad. I was keeping a secret just like he was. He was suffering. I didn't know he was suffering. People didn't know I was suffering. And I think, again, this story is not unique either. There's so many people walking around our planet who are suffering, and maybe not from sexual abuse, of course, but maybe from the trauma of losing a loved one and feeling guilty or shame, or having lost a job, or a financial shame. So there's so many stories that can develop around shame, and then that shame becomes so powerful. And then because we keep those secrets, we also have maladaptive behaviors to try to navigate that. And it gets really complicated. So I finally stopped. My kids were my cognitive motivation to just clock it and say, stop this behavior. So I stopped the behavior many years before I went to the jungle. But I became, maybe you've heard of like a dry drunk, right? A dry drunk is somebody who has actually quit drinking. So they don't have that maladaptive behavior, but because they haven't healed the emotions or their reason for drinking, they still are angry or crabby or short with other people or don't treat themselves kindly. So for me, how that manifested, I had quit all the eating disordered behaviors, but I hadn't healed myself. So I still wasn't kind to myself. I still had disempowering narratives where I didn't set myself up to thrive personally or socially. I kept very busy, so I wouldn't have to talk a lot, deeply, professionally. I excelled because then I could talk about cognitive, really important, smart things and not have to go to the emotional sort of spaces. So as an adult, then, I had stopped the actual behaviors, but then I went to the Amazon jungle, and I'm not sure if maybe that's the next place we go. What do you think?
Just a few more questions on this topic,
Okay,
because
great.
I do think yeah. No, I do think this is really, really interesting, because I have done another episode with this amazing inspirational woman as well before, and she talked about having an eating disorder, and that being as a result from sexual abuse as well from an ex-partner, and like her method of handling or coping was by just not eating. And so we talked about that in great length, and she said that after a lot of processing and therapy and thinking, she realized that food for her was her method of control. I think it started becoming like, if I can control the way I look, I can control my thoughts. And she was like, this is sounds really irrational to a person who maybe hasn't gone there, but in a sense, that's what it was. It was all about pulling that control back. And that if I can control the way I look, I can control the way I dress, the way I look on the outside, then it will somehow appease this sort of idea or this thought on the inside. Is that something you agree with? Like, looking back, do you think it was a control thing too?
It's 100% a control thing. Thank you for sharing that. The only thing I think I would add is it's controlling the food, not how one looks, for a lot of people. I can appreciate how that was her experience. However, a lot of people who have eating disorders do not look really healthy on the outside. They're not, thin or relatively thin people. Many people who suffer maybe from overeating disorder or from bulimia or a combination of these eating disorders, because there's handfuls of them. It's not all about looks, and they certainly don't control their looks. Somebody who is morbidly obese, for example, because of an eating disorder, it's about control for sure, but it's not about controlling how you look. It's about controlling the emotion and controlling this cognitive connection to food. And so the way that I explain it, and thank you for making the space to say this. The way I explain it, it's like with everything, there's a stimulus and a response, right? Everything. So I have a difficult emotion or a stress in my life. That's a stimulus. The response for a lot of us becomes food. Eat it. Food. Eat it. And it doesn't feel like an intentional connection. It's a natural connection for a lot of people, maybe because they're raised that way, like I was, maybe because it's a cultural experience for where they grew up, what country, what city, what state, whatever, how they grew up. So first off, it's this automatic connection to food and emotions. Back to the stimulus and response. So when then we feel an emotion that is complicated or difficult to sit with, food becomes that immediate go-to. So it doesn't feel like there's any space between the stimulus and response, like you have any control over it or even that it matters. Because cognitively, we all know, technically, I have control over what I put in my mouth or don't put in my mouth, for example. And so the idea with people who suffer from eating disorders, well, any addiction, I would argue, is that we need to just continue to increase the space between that stimulus and response. And so that's why, for me, it's being able to observe the difficult emotion that I'm experiencing and creating the space. I'm feeling a difficult emotion. Observe the emotion, create space. Don't jump to doing anything. Don't jump to reading. Don't jump to writing. Don't jump to eating. Don't jump to doing anything but sitting and observing. And when we do that, we actually gain control, or I don't use the word control here. I use the phrase we take responsibility for then our emotions. We take responsibility for the totality of our talk, our thought, our emotions, and our behavior. And when we do that, then we have a capacity to really thrive because we can align all of those things.
Right.
What we've also done is through that process of observation, we increase the space between the stimulus and the response. So again, whether it's food or a drug or shopping or sex or gambling or whatever it is, we just create opportunities for choice. So it's absolutely about control on the outset, or from the outside and inside. But as we recover, it becomes less about control for me anyway, and how I work with clients. And it becomes more about taking responsibility for the totality of who I am. And it's complicated because we're not taught how to do that.
That's true. And I guess part of that observing process requires you to open up that can of worms, to really look into that sort of situation and go back to feeling the same feelings that you may have felt back in those days. Like that fear, this fear is right now sort of triggered by this action, by this current situation that I'm in. But then it's very synonymous with a fear that I felt back when I was being abused. And so almost going back into that sort of situation. Does that require some level of intervention or having like a therapist or someone there to be able to talk you through it? Because observing is not always, with something so heavy and dark like this, it's not always going to be objective. You start to get, this flood of emotions kick in. Right.
That's right. And you have to start in a space of, first of all, being open to being curious about your own emotions. You're absolutely right. It's not necessarily a switch that we flip and it's, oh, now I can just stop, right? But it is about creating that space. So even if I'm continuing with disordered or maladaptive behaviors, it's that space of knowing and being accountable that I am using a maladaptive behavior to manage an emotion that is extremely uncomfortable. And yes, working with a therapist, I worked with a therapist for many, many years. There's some stories about that in my memoir. And for many people, that is one of the very best tools that they can use to help themselves open these doors for them to do the work in a safe spot. Now, this, of course, imagines a therapist who is a really good therapist who can help you do that.
Right.
And even very well-intended therapists sometimes don't have the skills to navigate some of these really difficult territories. And it's not because they haven't dedicated their life to helping others. They have and sacrificed in so many ways, I'm sure, themselves to help other people. But because people have great intent and might sacrifice themselves, that does not inherently make them really great at helping every pathology open spaces for healing.
Right.
So that's just a call for all of us who have been through this process to absolutely work with therapists, but also realize that we have a choice. And there's something that many people in my position, I can relate to, and maybe some of your callers or your viewers can relate to too, and listeners, is that once people start seeing a therapist, very often in my experience and in experience working with other people, something happens to us where because we have such depths of pain that we are navigating, having an authority in front of us can be really, really powerful. But it can also be destructive because in my experience with one therapist, constantly had, well, if you don't, said, not constantly, regularly, said things like, well, if you don't do X, Y, or Z, or they implied it, then you're not a cooperative patient. You're not actually doing what you need to do. So you can hear the blame and shame come into that. And so sometimes in therapeutic relationships, there's the fear of the person receiving therapy that they're not doing things right, or they're responsible if they're not healing. And so it can be really, really complicated.
Right.
But yes, therapy is very important. And I also think then in therapy, there comes a point where we have to recognize this responsibility of ours. You mentioned the word, fear, or an ability to go into these spaces. Well, here's some great news. When we clock fear in other parts of our lives, it's a transferable skill. So, afraid of, I'll use an example of spiders. I'm afraid of spiders, right? If we are able to clock our fear of spiders, maybe learn a little bit about them, maybe even let one, God help us, crawl on us, and really clock that fear, we are skill building in our ability to navigate fear. I mean, it could be a fear of public speaking, a fear of a social event, and just these smaller ways to conquer our fears can support us in excavating the most difficult and traumatic fears of confronting self, right? And confronting traumatic memories can help us realize that we can do it. And so I encourage people, even in their dreams, I support people in developing lucid dreaming patterns, or just using their dreams to help them get into some of these spaces too, because clocking fear, clocking our disempowering narratives, when we do that in smaller areas of our lives that are less consequential, those skills that we've developed to do that transfer into the greater part of our lives as we try to do this really deep and important work.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Do you feel like some of this, awareness came to you before you went to the Amazon, or was it you had to sort of have the experience at the Amazon for you to have this understanding?
Yeah, I think a lot. So the openings came before. I was desperate to heal. Again, that's not unique. For people who suffer from addiction, most of us know how debilitating this is, and we absolutely hate it, but we don't feel any power over it. We don't know that we can create space between the stimulus and the response to kind of get in there and have control, and have power. So before going to the Amazon, I was desperate. I had made many deals with God. If you heal me of this, I promise I'll do this, or I'll never do that again, or those sorts of things. But none of that worked, of course. And so when I got to the Amazon, I finally had this space in my life without any distractions, where I could sit with these difficult emotions and allow them to percolate, knowing I could do nothing about them. I could do nothing about them but observe. So one doesn't necessarily have to go to the Amazon, good news, to navigate this process, but we do need to get rid of the distractions and the clutter in our life that are supporting us in bypassing doing the work that we need to do. And the way the Amazon came to me, I was actually doing, I run a small foundation on the side, and I was doing a project in Tanzania, and it was this beautiful women's pottery project on the top of this big mountain. And one of the people I brought to support the project was a master potter who was going to build a kiln for these women, really beautiful. We're driving on this mountain in Tanzania, and he says to me from the back seat, "Hey, Luciana, have you ever tried ayahuasca?" And I just flipped. I mean, not flipped literally, but I turned around, flipped my body, and I turned around and I looked at him and I said, "No, but I have to do that." And I just knew for me, I had no idea what it was. And then he kind of laughed. He's like, "Well, that's not actually how it works, but And so, but my whole body just had this bolt of energy go through it. And I knew at that moment I had to be there. And that was going to be a place that I could unlock all the things that were stuck. And 3 weeks after that, event with him, I was actually in the Amazon. That's how powerful that was. And my family, super supportive. My husband was like, go, go. And I travel a lot anyway. But everybody was just very, very supportive. So I had no idea what it was going to be like. I had no idea what to anticipate when I got there. But when I did get there, as I said, it was a place of decluttering. It was also a place. So when I shared a minute ago about using experiences to clock fears and then know that when we clock those fears, it's a transferable sort of skill. Here's one example in the jungle. So I slept on this little wooden platform right, 10 feet or however far from a swamp that had anacondas and snakes and all kinds of crocodiles and critters and that sort of thing. And all I slept under was a mosquito net, right? So I was asleep one of the first nights in the jungle under my mosquito net on this wooden platform. And this huge rat ran right across in front of my head. And it was so close to the mosquito net that I could feel it like hitting my head. And I, well, like most people, had a bit of fear run through me, a lot of fear. And I was like, oh my God, no, you dread. And then it did it again, right? And then it did it again. And I was so like triggered emotionally. And then I just sank into it. And for whatever reason, I kind of chuckled and I'm like, look, you are in the jungle here, girlfriend, right? Step up here. Yeah. And in that moment, I just decided not to be afraid of it. And so it got named. It was named Mr. Tickles. And from that time on in the jungle, when Mr. Tickles would run by my head, I'd be like, Mr. Tickles, for crying out loud, go to bed. I'm tired. Knock it off. Right. Go to wherever and start playing. But that was one of my first experiences of recognizing the power of my mind to navigate extreme fear. Now, this little being probably wouldn't have killed me. I mean, maybe I would have gotten a disease if it bit me or, whatever, yeah. But it wasn't going to kill me. And so that beautiful experience, and I thank Mr. Tickles to this day, because that beautiful experience allowed me to, when these difficult emotions came up, to realize that I had a choice about how to think about them. I could continue to keep them stuck and in the space they were, or I could open a door and observe them and say, what is going on? And so for me, that was the switch. Mr. Tickles was that switch. I had to do the work of changing my mind, right? But once I did that, the door was then opened and there wasn't anything I couldn't handle at that point. And I did. And these traumatic memories and stories would come up and be, of course, very difficult. And I just slowly learned over this 30 days that as they came up, when I observed them, and then the process of observing even became a deeper, more refined process. But as I did that, my mind, body, and soul started to align. And I lightened, my being lightened. I was able to be more clear. I thought about myself very differently. And really importantly, my ability to envision a future I didn't know I could have became in my awareness. And it was remarkable, absolutely remarkable.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you have certain like outer body experiences, hallucinations? Like, I wonder whether like that also plays a part in helping to see, open up sort of the universe to you.
So the first 2 weeks in the jungle, we would do what's called a dieta, right? A dieta isn't a diet like we think in the Western world. What it means is, I know, what it means is the shamans, I was working with Shipibo shamans, healers. So they prescribe plants for you that they know will help with whatever pathology you're in the jungle to work through. And so, because they knew I had trauma in my experience, they prescribed a little plant called Colorado Pinon, which is like an internal scrubber. It scrubs all your organs and it hurts as it does this. P.S. And then the other one they prescribed is called Tantarao. Now, Tantarao is a jungle plant that after I took it the first time, I laid in my tambo. They said, just rest. I laid in my tambo, the little hut that I said, the wooden platform. And after about 20 minutes of receiving this medicine, my entire life was Technicolor. My history of my life from the time I was very little, Technicolor just before my eyes. And as my history was going before my eyes, there was no judgment, no drama. It was just, here's the story. And so between those two, as I would walk then, these little bits and pieces of my history would dislodge and come up and be ready for healing. So these plants, and people don't need the plants to do this. I believe I was gifted the process of working in the jungle and working with these plants so I could unearth this process to teach other people how to clock their disempowering narratives with observation and then some other tools. But for me, right, it was these little plants. So you asked about hallucinations. So these first 2 weeks, you're ingesting those plants because then these plants become your allies. The last 2 weeks, we did what are called ayahuasca ceremonies. Now, ayahuasca is a hallucinogen. Or it can be. Not everybody has visions who take this medicine. It is medicine. It's a very serious medicine. When I talk about it, I always tell people this is not a joke. It's not a toy. This isn't something, I just want to try it out and trip, as my siblings said in the 70s, or, it's it's absolutely not. And it's really important to ingest this medicine under the proper care of therapists or shamans. So that happened then the last 2 weeks. And yes, I had some beautiful experiences I had an experience of my grandfather coming in, and he was sharing his story with me, and he came in and he apologized for bringing addiction into the family. He was an alcoholic. He was my dad's, and his wife was an alcoholic. My dad was an alcoholic. My dad's brothers may have been alcoholics. And so he came in and apologized, and we had this beautiful experience together. I had other remarkable experiences in those spaces. So the way that I share this best, I think, is the plants came in and they were like little jackhammers. And these little jackhammers were dislodging the memories and emotions and experiences that had become kind of concretized, right, in concrete in my body. And they become so like in this concrete that I didn't have the power on my own to dislodge them. Some therapists can be so powerful that they help people kind of unlodge them. But the unlodging of them is just the start, because then you have to do the work, right? And every great therapist knows, they're just there to kind of coach you and support you through doing your own work. Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah. So the plants then, so this experience was remarkable. But what the plants and what the medicine taught me was this process of recognizing stimulus and response, and the process of creating space between the two. And whether people suffer from addiction or not isn't really the point, because all people, in my experience, suffer from, at some point in their life, disempowering narratives, stories that they took on as adults, that they learned in their childhood, patterns that they've created that kind of keep them stuck. And these patterns could be around thought, talk, behavior, emotions, etc. And they just kind of creep into our lives, and then they're there and we accept them as normal. I have this little saying, and it's normal is only that which we're surrounded with, right? Because what I perceive as normal is just I think, oh, that's just me. And what I share with people is there's no such thing as, oh, that's just me. Me
Right.
was created through a process of my own evolution, interacting on the planet and living on the planet. And I can recreate my stories and a different future for myself. So, we have this process of observation, which is fantastic, but that's only the start. So I observe this difficult memory, and then I look at the emotions behind that memory. But then when I look at the emotions, what I need to do is I need to look at the stories I tell myself about that emotion. So, for example, if I have the emotion of a lack of worthiness, if I feel unworthy, for example, or unlovable, when I look at that and I observe it and I just sit with it, my next step is to say, what stories do I say out loud that keep that narrative alive? And an example of that, which is so simple, might be when somebody gives me a compliment, my verbal response being, oh, it's no big deal. Oh, it's no big deal. That, oh, no big deal, that statement says to self that I'm not worthy of that compliment. Now, this seems very small. On one level, it seems so small, but our talk and our thought and our emotions and our behavior are so tightly wound that healing takes the necessity of looking at all four of those and then having all four of those align in toward our highest best self. And when our thought, talk, our emotions, and our behaviors are aligned toward our highest and best self, that's what I call thriving. So the subtitle to the book, An Inquiry into the Human Capacity to Thrive, is really about how to do that, how to align those, and then also supporting people just in stepping into their power. And no matter how, and recognizing that no matter how scary something is, we can develop the tools to clock that fear. And when we step into our power, we have the opportunity to design the lives of our dreams. And not just design the life of our dreams, but live the life of our dreams.
I like that. That's really interesting. And that's definitely something I feel like a lot of people would find really useful to sort of take away and like learn, because I think we are really surrounded in a world that is predominantly, unfortunately, still quite negative, and I think like to change that narrative, it's like it's hard to, even if you were raised in a perfectly happy, upbringing, happy family, loving, set of friends and family, you're exposed to the internet, you're exposed to the news, you're exposed to what's actually happening out there with politics and celebrities and social media, and you're just bound to kind of come across more negativity around you than positivity. And on the flip side as well, it's like sometimes I feel like when I'm being complimented, for example, this is me on a personal level, I'm not sure, maybe some people might be able to relate to this, but if I'm being complimented and if I were to respond by saying, yeah, I know, I agree, thank you. You're beautiful. I know I'm beautiful, thank you. That's me maybe, accepting that narrative that, yes, I am beautiful. But how do I come off without sounding, an airhead? People always say, be humble in your speech and in your language. So if we try to downplay the positivity in us so that we can be more approachable to the rest of the public, yet at the same time balancing that thought versus that behavior.
Right, right. And that comes from the God box too, right? The sense of humility, be humble. But it's really a false humility, I think. If somebody compliments me and I respond with it's no big deal, or, oh, make something like, don't accept the compliment, that's really false humility. That's not humility. For me now, because I totally hear what you're saying, been down that path for sure. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. I just say thank you. I just say thank you. And I think about other people who have been my mentors or my teachers or people who I really respect, and I want to share with them how important they've been to me. For them to dismiss my compliment is also disingenuous from a receiving, a sending, right? The sender and receiver in the communication. It's also disingenuous for the person who is sending you the compliment, because they're doing it because they care very often. And they really want you to know how much you've meant to them in maybe a small way or a big way, and that your smile matters, maybe.
Right.
And so simply being able to develop the habit of saying, thank you, that's so kind, is beautiful. And that's not arrogant. But I too was taught it's arrogant or self-centered,
Yeah.
So other narratives, though, I love what you said about society also putting pressures on us, because I think of how so much of the world defines success, and then the pressures that the world can put on individuals to fit into a mold of this equals success. And in capitalistic societies, success is often based on how much money you have or the status that you have. And so it can be really complicated. Like I was talking earlier, so many people have shame about money, and their external face is everything is great. I've got a great house. I've got cars. I've got stuff. And then they have tremendous debt, or they're working in jobs that they hate. And this isn't new. I'm certainly not the first person to recognize this. But what I hope is that we as a society, we will be able to see the connection between those external pressures when we live inauthentically, even though not ill-intended, have an impact on us, has an impact on our families, but it also has an impact on the world. If we shifted how we thought about some of these things as a society, our the ability for more people to experience joy, and pure joy, really joy in their lives, and bring their gifts fearlessly into the world would be exponential. That number would explode. And that's my hope. My hope in sharing my story is to create that explosion.
Right. Yeah. I agree. I also think that to an extent, it's like the human evolutionary process, right? I think that, the thing that startles us is the threat from like way back when you feel threat from an external, being. That's what brings our attention, and carrying that forward into current day affairs, like that is something that we are attracted to, that is something that we turn to. So there's that reason for why media is always like breaking news, the world is falling apart, because they know that that's the thing that's clickbaity, that's the thing that everyone's going to click into to read into. If it was to be like, oh, look at the wonders of the world, there's a beautiful bird that we have found in this world, like it's one of those that makes people go, but I agree. I think that, if like I've had this conversation with people before, like if the media just bombarded us with positive news for some time, we might cringe for a short bit of time. But at some point that becomes a new normal, and it sort of changes the whole atmosphere and the way that we behave towards each other, that we stop becoming each other's enemies and start becoming each other's friends. And this actually brings me to my next question, which is, you mentioned that when you went to the Amazon, you sort of like removed yourself from this environment of the society and, threw yourself in this complete wilderness. Do you think that kind of helped, being away from all of the media and all of the social stuff and all of, the world, and just sort of being in nature with other people like-minded, with that sort of same level of energy, sort of being on ayahuasca together, everyone working towards healing? Do you think that that's a really important step for people that are trying to heal? You think it's important for people to disconnect for some time?
Great. Absolutely. So I think everybody needs to be in nature in order to accelerate healing. When we are in nature, healing is accelerated. We can decompress. And it's like magic, perhaps, But nature is so powerful. It does not need to be, of course, an island in the middle of the Amazon. It could be a little garden space. It could be walking anywhere outside in the community that you have, or creating a little green sanctuary with a couple plants even in your house, if you can do that. So I will absolutely say that being in nature 100% matters, and connecting with nature. And I do recommend that for people. The next thing is decluttering. I have a person who we were actually talking yesterday, and for her to declutter, she got rid of, and yes, rid of, except for emergencies, her cell phone. She texted all of her people that she was close to, a lovely, successful woman. And she said, I will no longer be using my phone. I'm only going to use email, and I'm going to check it on these days. She needed space in her life to reconnect with herself, because so many in our world, we just become disconnected from self, not to mention disconnected from other people. And the jungle was really about connecting with self to do the healing. So anyway, so she chose that method. Now, a lot of your listeners are going to go, oh my gosh, I could never do that. Well, this is a really successful woman. And she just did this extreme measure because she knew that was her way to reconnect with self, and it needed to be extreme for her. But for other people, we know what our distractions are. And so it's us being accountable. Again, it comes back to being accountable and responsible for the totality of our life. I know what gets in my way and what's a distraction. So it's my responsibility to remove that distraction from my life. And when I have my distractions managed in a healthy way, then, you complement that with nature. You now have created a perfect environment to go through this process of observing, of creating space in life, of being aware of our disempowering narratives and clocking them, replacing our patterns that have augmented or supported our disempowering narratives, clocking those behavior patterns and replacing them with new. So environment and how we manage how we manage ourselves, and the responsibility that we take for ourselves, is really critical in order to be on this path to authentically thriving, for sure.
I love that. You are such an inspiration. I like that you've taken away so much from this hardship and this experience of yours, and you've like learned so much. So I want to ask you one final question before we end this interview, which is, what is one main, in maybe one sentence, one or two sentences, one main message you want our listeners to really take away from this? One core message you would like our listeners to take away from this? And I'll definitely plug in your book and your website details into the description as well for our listeners. So if you like to read more into it, there's access to that too. But yes, one main message.
Okay, so sorry, it's going to be a little longer than two sentences, but my company pillars, and this company started 3 days after leaving the jungle. The company pillars are: be beauty, live compassionately, love everyone, know peace, and be kind. And my hope for the world is that we can clock our disempowering narratives, realize we have the power to that we can connect with ourselves, and that we can bring these qualities of beauty, compassion, love, peace, and kindness into the world through our own thought, talk, emotions, and behaviors. And to know that it's just not that hard. It's just not that hard. It can be complicated, but it's not hard. And my goal is to support every person in doing just that, in stepping into their power and finding their path to thriving.
Amazing. That's so great. I can't wait to get my hands on this book as well, because I feel like I would love to know this sort of step-by-step process that I can sort of like take to align those, those four core elements that you discussed about here. Wow. Dr. Luciana, thank you so much for today. I've had such an amazing time speaking with you. And I really, really can't wait to, get our listeners to listen in on this episode.
Oh, thank you, Jennica. I'm so grateful for you and for the work you do and all the beauty you bring into the world through just who you are as a person and through your work. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed the episode and would like to help support the show, please follow and subscribe. You can rate and review your feedback on any of our platforms listed in the description. I'd like to recognize our guests who are vulnerable and open to share their life experiences with us. Thank you for showing us we're human. Also, a thank you to our team who worked so hard behind the scenes to make it happen.
Trzcinski, Stephan, Menzel.
The show would be nothing without you. I'm Jennica, host and writer of the show, and you're listening to Multispective.